Your Creative Push, Episode 1. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited.
Grab a coat, get out the front door and go. Walk into a creative journey.
Welcome to Your Creative Push, the podcast that pushes you to pursue your creative passions. I'm your host, Youngman Brown, and my guest today is Chris Riddell. Chris is a prolific writer and illustrator whose work is familiar to both children and adults. He is known especially for his distinctive line drawings with their clever caricature, fascinating detail, and often enchanting fantasy elements. In addition to his children's books, Chris is a renowned political cartoonist whose work appears in The Observer, The Literary Review, and the new Statesman. Chris is also the current Waterstones Children's Laureate, which is awarded once every 2 years to an eminent writer or illustrator of children's books to celebrate outstanding achievement in their field. Chris, tell me what I missed in that intro and maybe give us a peek into your personal life.
Right. Well, I think you've been very comprehensive. What I like to do, I think more than anything else, just to keep myself interested, is work across different fields and in different areas. And I think most importantly of all, work for different age groups. So I love illustrating children's books, and the wealth of material in children's literature is fantastic, from poems to fables to fairy tales through to really quite challenging YA material. These are all things that I love illustrating. And when I'm not doing that, working on for a newspaper, a national newspaper, doing a political cartoon once a week allows me to go into a different area, maybe sort of talk about sort of issues that have relevance in the adult world. And I enjoy that. I enjoy the contrast between the different areas I work in.
Do you ever find that the two of those kind of conflict with each other, like as far as your creativity?
Almost never. I think I would say it's the opposite. I think that the creative stimulus of considering a political issue for a newspaper can actually feed into the work I do for the very young. For instance, drawing, an elephant to represent, the Republican Party feeds in rather nicely to drawing an elephant doing a tap dance on a cream cake in a nursery rhyme for very young. The two sort of cross-fertilize each other, I think.
I like it. It's like two different muscles, but actually just one muscle.
I think that's true, and I think there is a tendency to rush to self-definition. So that we say, right, well, this is the artist we are. This is me. I do this thing, and sometimes context can change the way your work's perceived, and you don't need to worry too much about having a very particular style. I think the important thing is to get your thinking right conceptually. So to say, right, what am I trying to say, and how am I trying to communicate, whether it be for a 5-year-old or a 45-year-old professor of political science.
I love that. Can you tell me a little bit more about the Children's Laureate and what that's like?
It's a post that is sponsored by the publishing industry and by arts bodies in the UK in order to promote and talk about children's literature in all its forms. And so they choose a practitioner, sometimes a poet, sometimes a novelist, sometimes an illustrator like me, and we have 2 years to really talk about the issues that we feel are important in children's literature, and they give us a platform to do that. And I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I mean, my current, I suppose, concerns are around exactly what we're talking about now: creativity, and how do you keep children focused and excited and energized in a creative sense, certainly visually, through drawing and illustrating. And I want to sort of promote, I think, a much greater awareness of the role that visual literacy plays, both in education but also in our social lives. You know, the joy of drawing, the excitement of picking up a pen and drawing on in a sketchbook can often be overlooked. These can be seen as sort of rather tangential things to do, but I think they're at the very heart of any creative practice: the ability to look and the ability to draw.
I agree. And do you find that your education and your inspiration, do you find that it doesn't go necessarily to children, but to all ages?
Yes, I think drawing should be for all ages. And I think that it's such a civilizing thing to do. I think people take it as read that if you play a musical instrument, you might sort of have a sensitive or creative side. You know, if you are sort of, you know, you've got good coordination, you might be a good dancer, you might be good on the sports field. What gets overlooked often is the wonderful accomplishment that drawing can give you. You know, it's a whole window on the world. There is a wonderful quote by an English Victorian art historian called John Ruskin, and he talked about two types of people. There was the sketcher and the non-sketcher. And he said, you know, if you go for a walk down a country lane, the non-sketcher will walk down that country lane and will be asked at the end of his walk, how was your walk? And he would say, oh, it was fine. You know, I got from A to B. The sketcher, who would have a sketchbook with him, would look at the country lane, would stop, see the gnarled tree roots, see the wonderful foliage growing up, the shoots, the leaves, the patterns being made, and would sketch those things. And when he would get to the end of the walk and would be asked, how was your walk? He would say, well, it was amazing. There was this, there was that. Here was this amazing tree root. And he would be able to show the evidence in the sketch. So I think drawing is about looking, and sketching in a sense is part of that, where you can actually commit your observations to paper, and it's a way of making sense of the world. It works in an aesthetic sense, but it can also work in a very practical sense. You're trying to work out a problem. How do you visualize problems? Draw them, you know, analyze them in a sort of, you know, drawn form can often give you insights.
I love that. And I feel like that translates also with writing. If you are a writer, or if you've practiced writing, or if it's just a hobby that you do, you kind of see the world a little bit differently, and you're like, oh, that's something interesting. Or you see different angles of things, and you can really use your own creativity in that way. And I think that once you're a writer, as one of my professors used to tell me, once a writer, always a writer, and you can't even read the same way because you're reading as a writer.
That's true, and I think that's a very positive thing. It's almost like a sort of an on switch. You know, it's a new way of seeing the world, and I think there's a great danger that we can take everything for granted. We don't question enough, and sometimes people characterize questioning as sort of having issues and waving your finger and preaching sermons. But in fact, sometimes questioning is as simple as looking at something and saying, well, how does this work? You know, what is this? What is my response to this this visual stimuli? I'm often surprised when I walk around museums and art exhibits that I don't see more people, not necessarily art students, but just ordinary members of the public with sketchbooks in their hands, maybe making little annotations or maybe notes about what they're looking at, because it's a great meditation. I see drawing as a meditation and as a way of looking. And I think a writer will have a similar mindset, because they will be thinking of stories. They will see a moment in a crowded bar or an incident in the street, and I think they will interpret that. They'll take that as the beginning of something. They will say, well, I wonder who this person was and where they went and what happened after this thing I saw. Why do people sort of drop used coffee cups in the street and walk away like that? You know, what happened to that person? And that's where fiction starts to kick in. So I think you're absolutely right. You know, once a writer, you know, always a writer. And I think the same with any visual artist.
I often wonder not why people drop coffee cups on the floor, but why people drive Priuses and flick cigarettes out.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? I love that pieces. let's see sort of all the things that make us feel good while doing sort of bad things. Sort of, I've got the Prius, that's fine. Now I'll pollute in other ways. Interesting, particularly in the world we live in now, where we know that we have a ticking clock to prevent the world warming by 2 degrees and changing, the collective reality of the globe. And yet it's still seen as this rather abstract notion, and yet it's going to sort of affect us all.
Absolutely. It's quite scary. Going back to what you were saying about the sketcher and the non-sketcher, do you think that everybody has the ability to be a sketcher?
Yes, they do. And I believe that absolutely fundamentally. What happens, I think, for a lot of us is that through education, other priorities kick in. And so when we start in preschool and we're given a crayon and paper, we know what to do with it. We know how to make marks. We know that we embrace drawing as an enjoyable thing. And then we start to invent characters, and we start to sort of stories come along with those characters. One of the great delights is to draw with young children, and then ask them what they're drawing, and they'll tell you a great story about why this person, what this character is, and why they're there, and who does that in this way, why he's wearing a big overcoat, and why the flowers are particularly tall. They'll have a whole story for that, and it's, I think, innate in all of us, and it's an innate creativity that is a visual one. We then start to grow up a bit, and we look at other things, we absorb influences, and we start to say to ourselves, well, I can't draw as well as this person can draw. I can't draw as well as the guys at Pixar. I can't draw the perfect cartoon character. So obviously I can't draw, and we tell ourselves we can't draw. We move away from that. Drawing becomes problematic. It becomes something we don't do as well as we want to do, and we abandon it. And the saddest thing is when I talk to maybe middle graders, and I say who enjoys drawing, and the few hands go up, and I say, is there anyone here who doesn't draw, who can't draw? And inevitably hands go up, and I say, I'm terribly sorry, this is awful. You mean you can't draw? And they say, no, I can't draw. I say, well, we should try an experiment. And I get my sketchbook out, and I give them a pen, and I say, look, can you hold this pen? And obviously, unless there's a disability involved, of course they can hold a pen. And they pick up the pen, and they look at me slightly quizzically, and then I say, can you make a mark on this piece of paper? And they look at me. I said, go on, it's fine. It's a sketchbook. It's made for drawing in. Oh, right. And I say, make a mark, any mark you like. And they'll do a little squiggle. Sometimes they're embarrassed. Sometimes they're more flamboyant, but they make a squiggle. I said, that is fantastic. That's really good. I say, can you make another squiggle on this piece of paper? And they make another one. I say, and another, and another, and another. And so, they scribble. And then I stop them and I say, what a relief. Congratulations. You know what? You can draw. I thought for a horrible moment you couldn't, but look, you can draw. And they look at me. But that's, I said, that is drawing. That is drawing. And then we draw a little bit more, loosen that, and then things turn into other things, and they start to go with the whole notion. At its simplest level, it's a doodle. Everybody can doodle. The dullest businessman in the dullest meeting, as long as he's got a pen in his hand and a company report and nobody's watching, he'll doodle. He can draw. And I always call the doodle the little brother of the drawing. Everybody can doodle. Don't stop there. Take it forward. Doodle all the time. Doodle on everything. Keep drawing. Get a sketchbook and just keep your doodles in there. Guess what? If you draw every day, they'll grow. And they'll grow into other things. And they'll grow into very interesting things, very personal, idiosyncratic things. As I say, drawing is a meditation. And I think if you allow yourself that wonderful sort of phrase that Paul Klee, the artist, uses, which is taking a line for a walk. If you take a line for a walk, you'll be surprised where it'll take you.
That's beautiful, and I think that applies across the whole board with different creative pursuits, and that's really the purpose of this podcast, because I believe that everybody has that little itch that tells them, oh, you should draw this or whatever the idea is. And I think people use the excuse of, like you're saying, especially with social media, there's so much good stuff out there that they're able to look at. And if you're looking at that, that means that you're inspired by that and you want to incorporate that into your life. But I think people use excuses of having a job or, using their time to watch TV or whatever, and don't actually pursue that.
I think it's all about definitions. We live in one of the most extraordinary ages ever, where there is this huge community of sharing in a visual sense and in an artistic sense, so that you can go on Tumblr or Facebook and you can see people's art, and they're people who share art. And you mentioned sort of using TV maybe as an excuse not to draw, or sort of, I've got other things to do. What I find most fascinating is all the art that comes out of, fandoms, people who enjoy certain types of, genres of movies or certain types of books, who then produce art based on that. Well, that's as old as the hills. The artists have been doing that since the year dot. I mean, now we live in this wonderful world where, in a sense, your iconography can come out of Marvel Comics, or it can come out of, vampire movies. But some of the art is wonderful. And I actually rather enjoy the art that isn't so wonderful, because I think some of that shows a real sense of character. And it's a privilege often to see, occasionally people will send me work that they've done based on drawings I've done. And it's wonderful to see that, I suppose, cultural exchange. And we live in a world now where we can do this. You and I are talking across time zones, sort of unimaginable time zones. And what we say to each other in our conversation will be shared with more and more people in a way that wouldn't have been imaginable at the turn of the last century, for instance. So I think we are in I would say, a golden age of visual art, and we should all be talking about it a lot and carry on sharing the artwork we do.
I agree. We should realize how lucky we are and definitely take advantage of it too. Because I'm just a normal dude who likes to write, and here I am interviewing amazing people like Chris Riddell, and all I need is a microphone.
Well, I really, really hate to burst that particular bubble, but you see, I'm just a normal dude who likes drawing. You see, so it's all about context, and I think the wonderful thing is the way that we can all talk together, can't we? And reach out. We if we share enthusiasms, that's precisely what we can do. We can share enthusiasms.
Absolutely, and that's what it's all about. We talked about some resistance for people and some of the things that hold people back from being creative. What are some things that hold you back?
Well, I try not to be sort of self-critical in a sort of negative way. I mean, I think it's good to sort of question one's self and one's motivations, but that's not my starting point. My starting point is a very permissive one, which is essentially, in sketchbooks, I will draw. And I won't draw with an agenda. Sometimes I draw with no thought in my head at all. Other times I'll be listening to something on my headphones. I'll be sitting on a train. I'll have music playing in my ear, and I'll illustrate whatever the way the music makes me feel, or sometimes the actual words of the music, or sometimes I'll draw someone opposite me because it makes me feel happy. There are all sorts of different sort of stratagems for actually drawing in a sketchbook. But what then happens is that's a great way of reducing that resistance that says, well, I'll draw tomorrow. Because today I'm a bit distracted, I don't feel like it, I won't draw today because I'm not focused enough. I would say, look, draw precisely because you're not focused. Draw precisely because you feel you've got nothing to say. Draw because you've got a pen in your hand and an open sketchbook, and don't worry about it. No one need ever see what you draw, in that sense. But guess what? The next day you can open up, look at it, and think, there was something there. There was something there. And that breaks the resistance down. That enables you to take that next step and the next step. I think the danger, in a sense, is you never start the journey because you haven't finished all that vital packing and contingency planning, so you never begin the journey. You're always just getting that next thing you need. You need the flashlight, you need the bedroll. Hang on a minute, I'll get a better canteen before I set off on the trail.
Sure.
And you never set off. I would say, grab a coat, get out the front door and go, walk into, a creative journey. There will be moments to stop and evaluate, but I think resistance in the way that we're speaking about it is this sense of, well, who am I to have the temerity to do something creative? Maybe I shouldn't pick myself up in that way. I should sort of just go back to not doing something creative. And I say, well, no, creativity is open to everyone. And we all own our own creativity. And don't stop yourself. Don't, begin the journey, however small that is. Open the sketchbook, make a mark on the page, and then make another one and another one and another one. That's the way you start.
I love that. I think that's beautiful. And yeah, I always get that myself is, I'll do it tomorrow, or tomorrow looks like a better day to do that. But you kind of have to ask yourself, how many yesterdays have I said tomorrow? And guess what? Today is yesterday's tomorrow, if I'm saying that right.
You are, and the way you're saying that, I think, is very interesting, because it brings to mind the montage that is beloved in certain sort of Hollywood films, where the writer sits down, often with a sort of noisy typewriter if it's a period film, but these days on a laptop, and they write the first line, don't they? It's the whatever, sort of McIntyre walked into the bar, and then they start. No, McIntyre took off his coat, sat down in the chair in the bar. No, that's okay. And then they go through it, and it's a classic way to suggest resistance, to suggest writer's block, to suggest you're blocking yourself from sort of starting this. And I sometimes think the way around that is to say, right, okay, write that line 25 different ways, and you've got something right there. You've begun your journey right there. There is always a way in, I think. What you mustn't do is allow the blank page to sort of tyrannize you. You sit there, fill it up with stuff. I keep a work journal. I began keeping the work journal not because I had anything interesting to say, but because I had this beautiful journal that was given to me by my brother, who found it in a bookbinder's in Cairo. He knew I liked sketchbooks. He gave me this journal, beautiful paper. I had a favourite fountain pen, and I wanted to see what my handwriting would look like on the page. So I just wrote some stuff. Now, it wasn't about anything. It was the dullest thing ever, but the words looked nice on the page. And so I looked at this thinking, oh, that looks nice. I'd really like to see this book full of writing on pages. Doesn't matter what it's about. I could just write, fill the page up. And then it turned into this thing. It became a work journal because I had nothing to say. What was I working on yesterday? Well, I'd write that down. It's become a habit. And like all these things, you can develop bad habits, but you can develop really good habits as well. And this was a very good habit that I developed. And to this day, I keep a work journal, so I can go back, I can look at what I was doing 3 years ago. And it's just not because the language is interesting or evocative or poetic in any sense. It's very mundane, but it's more evocative, I would say, than a photograph. If I documented what I was doing photographically, I'd have to say, well, when was that? What was I thinking? A single line in a journal can bring it all back to you. And I think that's the power of language. Now, throw in some sketches, some sort of visual cues, and I think you've got a very powerful package. And I think that's where we're all going when we begin the creative journey. What we want to do is document or capture something, and start with a lowly ambition. Start with making things look beautiful on a page. See where it takes you.
I love that idea, and I get that too. I'll go back and read something that I've written, and I can remember exactly where I was. It's almost like when you get a smell of something and you are taken back to that place. And I think there's almost no other way to get that kind of memory.
That's true. I love thinking when we talk about this, the image I always get is Marcel Proust, the great novelist, sitting in bed, sort of tasting those little Madeleine cakes, and suddenly sort of the whole of this huge novel sequence comes to him. What I like most about that is I like to think of Marcel Proust, sort of shifting in his bed, sort of, on the crumbs of those cakes, sort of going to these extraordinary places in his mind, whilst never really leaving his bedroom. Another fascinating figure in that sense is Emily Dickinson, who is a poet whose work I find absolutely astonishing and strange and hard to understand. But I love her enclosed world, the fact that she didn't travel very widely. She really experienced an inner life through her creativity. And I think there are great parallels. Marcel Proust in his bed and Emily Dickinson in her bedroom in Amherst, Massachusetts. We are all a little bit like that in the current age, in a sense, sitting at our computer terminals. And it's often suggested, sort of gazing at laptops, gazing at glowing screens in our palms, that somehow we are, I suppose, distancing ourselves in a way. But I think the inner world is a wonderful one, and we can express ourselves online in that way. And it can be a very intense and very creative place to actually work. So I'm all for it. I'm all for, you know, going on voyages of the mind, going on imaginative journeys. And it seems to me that's what creativity can give us. It can give us sort of inner worlds to explore.
I agree. You'll never know where you'll end up. Chris, you are a very, very busy person, and I do appreciate you taking time for us. But can I ask, what is your formula for balancing your time with all that on your plate?
Well, that's an interesting one. And it's almost a philosophical question. When I am working, essentially what I'm doing is I'm usually in a seated position. I have art materials in front of me, and I use them: pens, paper, brushes, and I draw and I paint. Essentially, that's my working life. And because I work very hard, I need to find a way to relax. And my favourite way to relax, again, is in the seated position, surrounded by art materials, pens, papers, brushes, and I like to relax by drawing. So the philosophical question is, when am I working and when am I not working? I haven't worked this out. So I'm either working all the time or I'm relaxing all the time. I just don't know. So you'll have to sort of supply me with that distinction. On a slightly serious note, of course, there is work I do that I'm paid for, and people commission me and say, we would like this, please deliver it to us. And that's what I do. But when people aren't asking me to do that, I set myself challenges and tasks and things to do. And that is every bit as enjoyable as the commissions. And oddly, often some of the things I start off with just doing because I'm zoning out and relaxing and whatever, then turn into things that then go on to be saleable and publishable. So I try not to make too much of a distinction between these two things. And I think it's very important for people starting out on their creative journeys not to get too sidetracked by the marketplace, by what they are being, by trying to make this living. I know it's hard, and it's easy for someone like me, who's had a long and reasonably successful career, to be rather blasé about this. But I do think that when you're beginning your journey, you must stay switched on, stay creative, fight discouragement by setting your own goals and setting your own projects and doing your own work. And that can often lead to commissions and being known for something. And I think certainly, talking about social media, it is a wonderful platform to self-publish work in the most direct and least sort of vain way possible. In the past, commissioning someone, commissioning yourself to do a drawing and publishing it yourself these things used to be called vanity publishing. Well, now I think with the internet and the social media sort of platforms we have, you can publish some spectacular work yourself and get it out there and show people what you can do, and not wait to be asked. Don't wait to be commissioned.
Yeah, and at very little or no cost too, which I think is the most appealing part of it is that really anybody can do it.
Yes, that's true. And you will find people who are doing what you're doing as well. So a community builds up. And I love that. I love that sense of sort of sharing backwards, forwards, looking at Etsy, looking at people selling prints online. And you can often see real personality and idiosyncrasy coming through different artists' prints and the things that you know that they love drawing more than anything else, whether it be an antlered stag or drawings of wolves in moonlight or whatever. Some of them can be surprisingly interesting, often quite dark, but fascinating nonetheless, and self-published, which I think is a great new horizon.
I agree. Chris, it's time for the final push, and this is where I ask you to reach through the microphone, grab the shoulder of one of the listeners that you have inspired today and is thinking maybe I could do what he's doing too, and give them that final push.
The final push. Well, I would say reaching out. The first thing I would say is you absolutely can do what I do, and in fact, you probably are doing what I'm doing as well, because we're all attempting to be creative. We are all drawing. So my absolute first word of advice, I would say, is keep a sketchbook with you at all times and fill that sketchbook. Fill it up with anything, everything. Just make that, in a sense, the Bible of your daily life. And don't mediate it too much. Don't be too self-critical about it. You can be self-critical about your technique and how you go forward, but don't block yourself. Fight the resistance. Fill a sketchbook. When that is full, fill another one. And fill another one. And after a while, you're going to find that within those sketchbooks will be a chart of your creative life and your creative progress. And out of those sketchbooks, your career will grow. So it is begin with something as simple as a sketchbook, a blank set of pages, and fill them up. Fill them up with stuff. And keep looking. Keep looking around you, keep accepting influences and accumulating, your insights, but all the time, keep doing, keep drawing, keep sketching.
Keep doing it. I love it. Chris, thank you. I know how busy you are, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us and to give us that push. You can follow Chris on all the social medias. On Facebook, he's author Chris Riddell, and that's Riddell, 2 D's, 2 L's. His website's chrisriddell.co.uk. On Twitter, he's at chrisriddell50. And on Instagram, which I highly suggest you subscribe to him, is Chris_Riddell. I will also have all those links on our show notes page at yourcreativepush.com/Chris Riddell, and there'll be links there to go and buy his stuff as well. You have beautiful books as well. I love Goth Girl.
Thank you.
All right, Chris, thank you so much again, and have a great day.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Wow, what a value-packed episode 1. Thank you, Chris, for that. So many good things in this episode, but the number one thing that I just want to go back to is, how putting off creativity until tomorrow leads to never, ever getting it done. You can't just keep putting it off. And you have to ask yourself, are you the sketcher or are you the non-sketcher? I think you probably already know that. If you're listening to this, you're the sketcher. That doesn't have to be with sketching art. It could be with, are you a writer? Are you, fill in the blank, whatever the reason is that you're listening to this show to get inspiration for, you already know that you are. So you might as well do that creative endeavor that is on your mind, because you'll regret it if you don't. On tomorrow's episode, I interview Carl Martins.
Believe in what you're doing. Believe in what you're doing and just do it.
A really differently geared conversation that I had with Carl, and a very, very compelling one as well. So be sure to check that out tomorrow. But for today, hopefully this gave you the push you needed to get your stuff done. So go do your work. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for subscribing. And thank you especially for the ratings and reviews that you give on iTunes. That's the number one way to support the show right now, and it's baby stages. It really helps to get the word out there. And if you are so kind as to give a 5-star review, I might say your name on the air next week. So keep that in mind. Thank you so much for your support, and we will see you tomorrow.